The studio air hung heavy, tasting of marble dust and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. I stood my ground, wrapped in my tailored wool coat, and issued the challenge I'd rehearsed. "Your recent showing was technically perfect, Paisley," I said, my voice cutting the gloom. "But it was spiritually dead." She didn't flinch. She just closed the distance, her heavy boots crunching on stone chips, hands coated in gray slip. She reached out, smudging wet clay along my jawline, pinching my chin to force my gaze to hers. Her delivery was quiet, precise, and devastating. "You've already lost. I am a creature of galleries, of climate-controlled rooms and hushed, reverent whispers. My reputation as a critic is built on a foundation of academic rigor and emotional distance. I use theory as a shield against feeling, dissecting art so I never have to let it touch me. But standing there, in that massive, repurposed industrial foundry on the edge of London's grey sprawl, I felt my defenses trembling. The space was a cavern of shadows and light, smelling of wet earth, espresso, and the grit of industry. It was cold, echoing, and unapologetically real. Paisley was the architect of this chaos. She was an Italian-American force of nature, carrying a lineage of Tuscan stone carvers in her blood and the dust of Carrara in her hair. She was intense, physical, and completely unconcerned with the polite society I governed. While I stood there in my structured wool coat and Italian leather gloves, she moved through a landscape of chisels, wire armatures, and half-formed torsos that looked like they were fighting to escape the stone. The contrast between us was absolute. I was the silence after the concert. She was the riot. I watched her turn away from my critique, dismissing my presence as if I were a draft from the window. She approached a rough block of marble, lifting a heavy mallet with a casual strength that made my breath catch. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was violent, a rhythmic assault that filled the vast emptiness of the studio. She attacked the stone, not with anger, but with a terrifying focus. I tried to maintain my composure, to be the observer, but inside, I was unraveling. The truth was, I was there to dismantle her reputation, because I could no longer build my own. My creative well had run dry 2 years ago. I hadn't written a single honest sentence since. I was a parasite, feeding on the passion of others, hoping that if I stood close enough to someone like Paisley, some of that fire might jump the gap. But watching her work, watching the sweat dampen her tank top and the muscles in her back shift with every strike, I felt only the ache of my own emptiness. She was everything I wasn't, raw, unpolished, and alive. I tried to analyze her technique, to find the flaw in her stance that would let me dismiss her. "You're forcing the material," I shouted over the noise, my voice sounding thin and petty. "The classical approach requires patience, not brute force." She didn't stop. She didn't even look up. She just kept swinging, chips of white stone flying like shrapnel, landing near my expensive boots. It was infuriating. I was used to artists desperate for my approval, desperate for the validation my words could provide. Paisley treated me like a ghost. She was entirely consumed by the act of creation, muttering to the stone in Italian, coaxing secrets out of the rock with violence. I walked the perimeter of her workspace, careful not to step in the puddles of slurry. The studio was a map of her obsession. Sketches pinned to walls, photos of ancient ruins, tools that looked more like weapons than instruments of art. In the corner, a pot of coffee boiled on a hot plate, the scent fighting a losing battle against the dust. I felt a pang of something sharp in my chest. Jealousy? Fear? She lived in her hands. I lived in my head. "You can't ignore me forever," I said, moving closer to the blast zone. "I'm the one who decides if this collection matters." The hammering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It rang in my ears, a high-pitched frequency that made the air feel thin. Paisley lowered the mallet, her chest heaving, the dust settling around her like a halo. She didn't turn around immediately. She just stood there, breathing, the energy radiating off her back hot enough to burn. I waited, my pen hovering over my notebook, ready to capture her defense. I expected words. I expected the game. Instead, the silence stretched, filling the room until it felt like the air itself was waiting for permission to move. The ringing in my ears faded, replaced by the sound of her breath and the distant hum of the city. leaving us alone in the quiet. Paisley turned slowly, dragging the back of her hand across her forehead, leaving a streak of pale gray mud against her olive skin. She looked at me like a material she hadn't quite figured out how to cut yet. Her eyes were dark, heavy with an exhaustion that looked ancient, and they didn't blink. They assessed. They measured the structural integrity of my resolve against the weight of her reality. I wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of my critique, but my feet felt heavy, anchored by the sheer gravity of her presence. She walked toward me, the steel toe of her boot kicking a chisel across the concrete floor. The sound skittered between us, sharp and intrusive. "You come here with your notebook and your vocabulary," she said, her voice rough from the dust, a low timbre that vibrated in my chest. "You talk about spirit, about passion, but you judge the fire by reading about the smoke. You've never burned." I opened my mouth to defend my credentials, to list the exhibitions I'd curated, the careers I'd launched with a single paragraph. But the words died in my throat. Because she was right. I knew the theory of heat, but I had forgotten the feeling of the flame. "So prove it," she said, stopping inches from me. The smell of her was overwhelming. Wet earth, ozone, and the distinct bitter tang of espresso. "You want to understand why my work is spiritually dead? Then you stay. You don't visit, you don't observe, you inhabit." "I have a schedule," I said, my voice sounding absurdly small. "I have deadlines." "Deadlines are for people who manufacture products," she countered, wiping her hands on a rag that was more clay than cloth. "I'm offering you a chance to witness a creation. 10 days. You live here, in the studio. You sleep on the cot in the loft. You eat what I eat. You breathe this dust until you taste it in your sleep." She stepped closer, invading my personal space with an arrogance that was almost magnetic. No phone, no watch, no connection to that sterile world you protect so carefully. You become part of the room, part of the texture. If you leave before the work is finished, you admit that your critique is nothing but hollow noise. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, escaping in dark tendrils around her neck. Her arms were corded with muscle, dusted white like a statue coming to life. It was a ridiculous proposition. It was unprofessional, it was dangerous, and it was the most interesting thing that had happened to me in years. My arrogance flared, a defensive spark. I believed I could withstand her bohemian theatrics, analyze them and dismantle them from the inside. "Fine," I said, unbuttoning my coat. The wool felt suddenly suffocating. "I accept. But don't expect me to be a silent partner. If I see a flaw, I will name it." Paisley scoffed, a short, sharp sound that was half laugh, half bark. She turned back to her work table, muttering something low and rapid in Italian. "L'arroganza di chi non si sporca le mani," she whispered to the marble. "The arrogance of those who do not dirty their hands." She didn't think I understood, or perhaps she didn't care. She saw my confidence as fragility wrapped in expensive fabric. She walked to the massive iron door that separated the studio from the street, from the London drizzle, from my safe, curated life. She didn't hesitate. She threw the bolt. The sound of the metal sliding home echoed through the cavernous space like a cell door slamming shut. It was a heavy, final sound. The air in the room seemed to shift, thickening, sealing us in. I stood there, clutching my notebook, suddenly aware that the exit was no longer an option. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was waiting for us both. Day 2 was a study in the violence of silence. Paisley had stripped me of my agency with a single command. Sit, watch, don't speak until you understand. I was relegated to a high wooden stool in the corner, a perch that felt less like a vantage point and more like a pillory. My legs cramped, accustomed to the ergonomic embrace of office chairs, not this rigid, unforgiving wood. The studio had settled into a rhythm that was maddening in its monotony. There was no music, no conversation, only the wet, cloying scent of clay and the omnipresent dust that tasted like crushed bone. It coated my throat, a dry grit that water couldn't wash away. I became hyper-aware of the soundscape. The clink, clink, thud of the chisel meeting stone wasn't just noise. It was a language I didn't speak. It was a rhythmic percussion that seemed to sync with my own pulse, slowing it down, forcing me into her tempo. I watched her. There was nothing else to do. In the gallery, I looked at the art. Here, I was forced to look at the artist. And she was a revelation of kinetic energy. Paisley worked with a physicality that bordered on aggression. She wore a stained gray tank top that clung to her damp skin, revealing the topography of her labor. I watched the way the muscles in her back bunched and released, a mesmerizing interplay of tension and torque. Every strike of the mallet was a transfer of energy, a kinetic conversation between her will and the marble's resistance. She didn't just carve, she fought. Sweat ran down her temples, mixing with the stone dust to form pale rivulets on her neck. It was raw, uncurated, and utterly mesmerizing. I found myself tracking a single drop of sweat as it traced the line of her spine, vanishing into the waistband of her heavy work pants. The heat in the room wasn't just thermal, it was biological. She muttered constantly, a stream of low Italian that sounded like prayer or profanity. She was coaxing the form out of the block, arguing with it. "No," she'd hiss, striking a flake of white loose. "Don't fight me. Lasciami entrare. Let me in." My internal critic, usually so vocal, so ready with a deconstructive theory or a witty dismissal, began to stutter. I tried to frame her movements in the context of neoclassical revivalism or brutalist methodology, but the words felt dry and brittle against the humid reality of her exertion. You can't deconstruct sweat. You can't theorize the sound of breath hitching with effort. The raw energy in the room defied my academic lexicon. I was trying to read a thunderstorm. The intellectual distance I prized was fogging over. I wasn't analyzing her anymore. I was absorbing her. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had come here to prove her spiritual deadness, yet I was the one feeling a resurrection of sensation. My notebook lay closed on my lap, the pen capped. There was nothing to write, only this heavy, suffocating presence. Then the rhythm broke. Paisley stopped mid-swing, the mallet hovering in the air. She didn't turn her body, but she turned her head, catching me in the act of consuming her image. I should have looked away. I should have checked my nails or feigned interest in the ceiling, but I was locked in. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and stripped of all social pretense. She held my gaze, not with hostility, but with a challenge. It was an acknowledgement of the tension pulling taut between us, a wire vibrating in the space where the air used to be. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a flush that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. I was a voyeur, caught staring at the sun. She didn't smile. She just held the look for 3 heartbeats, long enough to make me struggle for air, before turning back to the stone. The clink resumed, louder this time. The light from the high, clear-story windows began to shift, the afternoon sun cutting through the gloom, turning the floating dust motes into a suspension of gold. The silence had hardened into a suffocating density, pressing down on my shoulders. I was still perched on that wooden stool, spine rigid, legs crossed at the ankle, a pose I'd perfected in front of gallery mirrors. It was the posture of someone who judges, not someone who exists. I was holding myself apart from the room, refusing to melt into the texture as she had demanded. Paisley set down her chisel. She didn't wipe her hands this time. She just turned and walked toward me, her stride purposeful, eating up the distance between us. "You're lying," she said. I blinked, startled. "I haven't said a word." "Your body is lying," she corrected. She stopped right in front of me, looming. Up close, the details of her were overwhelming. Fine gray dust coated her eyelashes. Her tank top was damp, clinging to her skin, and I could feel the heat radiating off her, a furnace stoked by hours of physical labor. The smell was intense. The bitter roast of the espresso she drank cold, the metallic tang of ozone, and the dry, ancient scent of silica. The world narrowed down to the charged space between us. "You sit like a diagram," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Shoulders up to your ears, jaw locked. You aren't breathing. You're sipping air like it's poison." I opened my mouth to argue, but she moved before I could speak. Her hand, heavy and coated in white dust, landed on my shoulder. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was the grip of someone who handles stone for a living. Her thumb found the knot of tension at the base of my neck and dug in. I gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded too loud in the quiet studio. It hurt. It was a precise, targeted pain. "There," she murmured. She didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned in, invading my space until I was forced to look up at her. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "You hold your breath like it costs money. Let it go." "I am breathing," I managed to say, though my voice was tight. "No," she said. "You're surviving. That's different." Her other hand came up. I flinched, expecting a strike or a shove, but her fingers brushed my jawline. Her skin was rough, calloused from the tools, sandpaper against the smoothness of my face. She traced the line of my mandible, her touch clinical, yet devastatingly intimate. She wasn't caressing me. She was examining me, feeling the bone structure like marble grain. I felt a smudge of wet clay transfer to my skin, marking me. "Unlock your jaw," she commanded, her voice a low rumble near my ear. I obeyed without thinking. My mouth fell open slightly, the tension I hadn't realized I was carrying snapping loose. Her fingers moved down my neck, tracing the pulse that was hammering against my skin. She must have felt it, the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of my heart against her fingertips. "Better," she whispered. The word was a vibration against my skin. I was trembling. I realized it with a jolt of humiliation. My hands, resting on my knees, were shaking. It wasn't fear. It wasn't exactly desire either, though the heat of it was similar. It was the sensation of being stripped. My tailored coat, my academic vocabulary, none of it mattered under the weight of her hand. She had bypassed my intellect entirely and laid a hand directly on my nervous system. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick, charged with the static of unsaid things. I was acutely aware of her physical reality, the rise and fall of her chest, the strength in her fingers, the sheer, undeniable force of her existence. I felt small, fragile, and terrified. Not of her, but of myself, of the sudden yawning crack in my armor. "You're terrified of feeling it," she said softly, her thumb brushing the hollow of my throat. "You think if you let the chaos in, you'll break. But stone doesn't break when you strike it true. It reveals. It becomes what it was meant to be only after the violence of the chisel." She pulled her hands away abruptly. The loss of contact was a physical shock, leaving my skin burning where she had touched me. I almost reached out to pull her back, a reflex I barely suppressed. She stepped back, wiping her hands on her pants, the moment broken, but not gone. She looked at me one last time, her expression unreadable, before turning back to her bench. "Breathe," she threw over her shoulder, "or you'll pass out before we even start." I sat there, chest heaving, listening to the clink, clink, clink resume, wondering what exactly I had just lost. By day 5, the silence had changed. I was sitting on my stool when Paisley dropped a wet, heavy slam of matter onto the workbench. It was a lump of gray clay, cold and unformed. "Stand up," she said. It wasn't a request. I stood, smoothing my trousers. "I'm here to observe, Paisley. That was the deal." "The deal was, you understand," she corrected. "You can't understand the fire by watching it burn. You have to put your hand in." She pointed at the clay. "Make something. Anything. But stop analyzing it." I hesitated. The clay looked revoltingly messy. But the challenge in her eyes was a physical weight. I reached out, fingers tentative. The moment I touched it, the cold seeped into my skin. It was sticky, yielding in a way that felt almost obscene compared to the dry paper I was used to. I tried to mold it, my brain jumping to geometry. I tried to force the chaotic lump into a sphere, a perfect, logical shape. "No," Paisley barked. She moved behind me so fast I didn't hear her boots. "Stop thinking. Your head is a cage. Your hands know more than your brain ever will." "I don't know what you want," I snapped, frustration bubbling. My cuffs were already stained. My manicured nails were ruined. I felt ridiculous, a child playing in the mud while a master watched. "I want you to feel the resistance," she murmured. And then she was there. She stepped in close behind me, her chest brushing against my back. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt of heat against my spine. She reached around, her arms caging mine, and placed her hands over my hands. Her palms were rough, warm, and coated in the slip drying on my skin. She didn't ask for permission. She simply took control. "Push," she commanded, her voice a low vibration against my ear. "Don't pet it. Dominate it." She pressed down, forcing my fingers deep into the wet mass. I gasped at the sensation, the suction of the clay, the overwhelming strength of her hands guiding mine. We moved in tandem. She wasn't caressing me. She was using me as a tool to work the medium. But the line between tool and artist blurred instantly. I could feel the rhythmic thrum of her heart against my back. The air thickened, charged with the scent of wet earth and her sharp sweat. "Close your eyes," she whispered. Her breath ghosted over my neck. "Stop looking at the shape. Feel the texture. Where is it weak? Where does it push back?" I closed my eyes. Robbed of sight, the world narrowed down to the sensation of her body against mine and the yielding clay between our fingers. We worked the mound, kneading it, folding it. My breathing hitched, syncing with hers. In, out, push, pull. It was a rhythm ancient and undeniable. There was nothing sexual in the placement of her hands, strictly on mine, strictly on the work. Yet the intimacy was shattering. It was a synchronization of intent. For the first time in years, my mind went quiet. The critical voice drowned in the sensory overload. "There," she said, her voice rough. "Do you feel that? The tension in the material?" I did. I felt the clay fighting back, elastic and alive. I wasn't thinking about art history. I was just feeling the grit, the moisture, the sheer existence of the matter. "I feel it," I whispered. She held me there a moment longer, the pressure of her body a grounding weight, before pulling away. The loss of her heat left me shivering. I looked down at the clay. It wasn't a sphere. It was a twisted, torque-filled shape that looked like a muscle straining. It was ugly. It was honest. "Go wash up," she said, her voice returning to its flat command, though her eyes lingered on my flushed face. I walked to the slop sink, my legs unsteady. I turned the tap. I plunged my hands into the freezing stream, scrubbing at the gray crust. The water swirled down the drain, dark and murky, taking the last of my pristine, untouchable ego with it. I watched it go, feeling raw, exposed, and terrified to find that I didn't want the armor back. I woke with a start, my body jerking against the unfamiliar hardness of the cot. The studio was dark, but not pitch black. A single halogen work light was clamped to a steel beam high above, casting a stark, triangular cone of illumination that cut through the gloom like a lighthouse beam in a storm. The rest of the foundry was swallowed by shadows, long, distorted shapes that stretched and pooled in the corners, transforming the unfinished sculptures into watching sentinels. The air was different now. The aggressive, metallic tang of ozone and flying sparks had settled, replaced by the cooler, damper breath of the sleeping building and the faint, sweet smell of curing clay. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. My neck was stiff, a souvenir from the wooden stool. I looked toward the light. Paisley was still awake. She was sitting on the floor in the center of the illuminated circle, legs crossed, a small bronze cast resting in her lap. The violence of the day, the hammering, the shouting, the physical wrestling with the earth, had evaporated. She was polishing the metal with a soft rag, her movements rhythmic and hypnotic. Shh, shh, shh. It was a sound like the ocean, quiet and eroding. I stood up, the concrete floor seeping cold through my socks, and walked toward the circle of light. She didn't look up, but she knew I was there. She reached out with her free hand and grabbed a bottle of heavy red wine sitting on the floor beside her. No glasses, just the bottle, dark and unpretentious. She held it out to me without breaking the rhythm of her polishing. "I thought you said deadlines were for manufacturers," I said, my voice raspy from the dust I'd inhaled all day. "Stone sleeps," she murmured, her voice blending with the shadows. "Metal waits. But I don't." I took the bottle. The glass was warm from her grip. I sat down on an overturned crate opposite her, entering the sanctity of the light. I took a drink. The wine was thick, tannic, and tasted of oak and dark fruit, a shock to a palate that had tasted nothing but silica and espresso for days. It felt like a violation of the asceticism she'd forced on me, a sudden rush of sensory pleasure that made my head spin. "My grandfather," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He was a stone carver in Carrara. He had hands like roots, twisted and impossible to break. He used to tell me that the stone has a memory, that it remembers the pressure of the earth before we were born. When you cut into it, you aren't making a shape, you're releasing a ghost." She stopped polishing and looked down at the bronze, her thumb tracing the curve of a shoulder she had cast. "He died with dust in his lungs. He coughed up white mud until the end. But he never stopped listening to the stone. He said the silence inside the rock was the only truth worth hearing. It was the first time she had spoken to me as a human being, rather than a project or an obstacle. The hostility that usually armored her was gone, stripped away by the late hour and the exhaustion. "I envy that," I admitted, the wine loosening the knot in my chest. "The certainty, the ability to hear something other than your own doubt." Paisley looked up then. In the harsh halogen light, the exhaustion under her eyes looked like bruises. "You have certainty," she countered softly. "You write with a scalpel. You cut things apart with absolute precision. You tell the world what is dead and what is alive." "That's not certainty," I said, the words tumbling out before I could check them. "That's fear." She went still. The rag stopped moving. "I didn't become a critic because I loved art," I whispered, the confession tasting like ash and wine. "I became a critic because I was terrified to be an artist. I stood in front of a canvas once, 20 years ago, a blank white square, and I froze. I couldn't make a mark. I was so afraid of making something mediocre that I made nothing at all. It's safer to judge the fire than to burn, remember?" The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, judgmental silence of the first day. It was thick, velvet, and intimate. We were just two women sitting in the wreckage of our own expectations, the professional antagonism dissolving in the dark. Paisley set the bronze down on the floor. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, closing the distance between us without moving. Her eyes searched mine, not with the cold assessment of the sculptor measuring a block, but with a sudden, startling recognition. She saw the hunger I hid under my wool coats. She saw the cowardice I dressed up as intellect. "Mediocrity is just a bruise," she said, her voice dropping to a register that made the hair on my arm stand up. "It heals. But silence? Silence is a scar that never fades. You aren't empty, critic. You're just clogged. You filled the well with words, so you wouldn't have to drink the water." She held my gaze, unflinching. The vulnerability in the room was palpable, heavier than the marble blocks surrounding us. For the first time, I didn't want to look away. I wanted to be seen. The air between us charged, shifting from intellectual combat to something far more dangerous. "Drink," she commanded gently, nodding at the bottle in my hand. I lifted the bottle and drank, watching her over the rim, feeling the warmth of the wine and her gaze settle deep in my stomach. The duel had changed ground. We weren't fighting anymore. We were falling. Day 8 arrived with a shift in the studio's atmosphere. The ambient noise of the city receded, leaving only the sharp, focused radius of Paisley's attention. She had set up a new armature, a skeletal wire cage mounted on a turning stand. She didn't point to the stool. She pointed to a wooden chair she'd dragged into the center of the room, directly under the skylight. "Sit," she said, "and don't hide." I sat. I adjusted my coat, crossed my legs, and prepared my face, the neutral, interested mask I wore at gallery openings. Paisley walked around me once, slowly, like a predator circling a trap that hadn't quite sprung. She stopped in front of her workstation, grabbed a handful of wet clay, and locked her eyes on mine. It wasn't a look. It was an invasion. For the last week, I had watched her battle stone. Now, she turned that terrifying, singular focus onto me. It was the most unnerving experience. As a critic, I observe. I stand behind the velvet rope and judge. I am the eye that dissects. But sitting in that chair, stripped of my notebook and my distance, I realized I had become the subject. And Paisley didn't paint pretty pictures. She dismantled. She began to work. She didn't look at the clay. She looked at me. Her eyes traced the line of my throat, the tension in my jaw, the way my breath caught when she leaned forward. Her hands moved blindly on the bust, tearing at the clay, smoothing it, gouging it. It was a phantom sensation. Every time her thumb pressed into the wet earth, I felt a ghost of pressure on my own skin. When she raked her fingernails down the cheek of the sculpture to create texture, I flinched, my hand flying to my own face. "Stop," she ordered, not pausing her work. "Don't fix yourself. I don't want the mask. I want the ruin." "I'm not a ruin," I protested, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "You are," she said, her voice dropping to that low, intimate register that made my stomach flip. "You're a beautiful, tragic ruin of good intentions and fear. Let me see it." She stepped away from the stand and came toward me. The air between us compressed. She reached out, her hand coated in gray slip, and hovered her fingers inches from my face. She didn't touch me, but the heat of her hand was palpable. She traced the air in front of my lips, my eyes, my forehead. It was a magnetic pull. I felt my head tilting back, my lips parting, drawn by the gravity of her hand. "You want to retreat," she whispered. "You want to go back to your tower and write your little words. But you can't. Because now you know what it feels like to be real." She returned to the clay with a sudden, violent energy. She was sculpting with a feverish intensity, her breathing syncing with mine. It wasn't sexual, not explicitly, but it was deeply, undeniably erotic. It was the intimacy of having someone look at your darkest, most guarded secrets and say, "I can use this." I caught a glimpse as she turned the stand. It wasn't flattering. It was terrifying. The face emerging from the gray mud wasn't the composed professional I saw in the mirror every morning. It was a woman hungry, terrified, and wide open. The mouth was slightly open, as if gasping for air. The eyes were hollowed out, staring at something invisible. It captured the exact feeling of the creative drought I'd been hiding for 2 years. It was my shame, rendered in 3 dimensions. "Is that how you see me?" I asked, my voice trembling. Paisley stopped. She looked from the clay to me. "That is who you are when you think no one is watching," she said. "That is the woman who wants to burn." The tension in the room peaked. The silence was no longer empty. It was screaming. I realized then that this entire week, the challenge, the silence, the clay, had never been about proving her art was valid. It had been a trap designed to break the control I held over my own life. She hadn't just challenged my critique, she had challenged my existence. And looking at that raw, ugly, beautiful face in the clay, I knew I was losing. And God, I wanted to lose. She grabbed a wet cloth. With a heavy, wet thwack, she draped it over the bust, shrouding the face in darkness. The sudden denial of the image was a physical ache. "We're done," she said, shutting the door on the moment. But the air still vibrated, and I sat there, shaking, completely unable to stand. The final morning broke with the violence of a tempest. Rain lashed against the high, clear-story windows, sounding like applause from a chaotic god. Gray light filtered down, illuminating dust motes dancing in the turbulence. I stood in the center of the room, my coat folded over my arm, my bag packed by the door. The 10 days were up. The sentence was served. But I didn't feel free. I felt tethered to the center of the room, where the covered bust waited on its pedestal. Paisley stood beside it. She looked wrecked. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands were stained with permanent gray clay. She wasn't wearing her usual armor of indifference. She shifted her weight from one heavy boot to the other. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrifying fragility of an artist showing her soul. "The terms were clear," she said, her voice barely rising above the rain. "You stay until the work is done. It's done." She reached for the wet cloth. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I wanted to look away. I wanted to leave now, keep my dignity, and write a scathing review from the safety of my apartment. But I couldn't move. She pulled the cloth away. The wet slap of the fabric hitting the floor was the only sound in the world. I stared, and for the first time in my professional life, the vocabulary failed me. I had words for texture, for form, for negative space. I had no words for this. The bust was me, but not the version I saw in the mirror. It wasn't the composed, icy critic who could destroy careers. It was the woman who had sat on that stool for 10 days, stripped. The clay captured the tilt of my chin, showing defiance, masking fear. The eyes were hollowed out deep, catching the shadows, looking not at the viewer, but through them, searching for something lost. The mouth was parted slightly, caught in a breath that never finished. It was raw. It was terrified. It was undeniably, painfully alive. She hadn't just captured my likeness. She had rendered a map of my own repression in gray earth. It was spiritually violent. I walked toward it, drawn by a gravity I couldn't resist. I stopped inches from the clay face, feeling the cold radiating from it. The resemblance was so intimate it felt like a violation, yet I couldn't look away. "Well?" Paisley asked. The word hung in the air, fragile as glass. I turned to look at her. She was standing close, so close I could smell the rain on her skin and the stale coffee on her breath. She was waiting for the judgment. She was waiting for the critic to speak. "I was wrong," I whispered. The admission tasted like metal. "I said your work was spiritually dead. I was wrong." Paisley let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a week. She took a step closer, invading my space one last time. The heat of her body was a shock against the damp chill of the studio. We were inches apart, the air between us charged with enough static to spark a fire. Her eyes searched mine, looking for the lie, but there wasn't one left in me. "You didn't just sculpt me," I said, my voice trembling. "You excavated me." She raised her hand. It hovered near my face, trembling slightly. Her fingers were rough, stained, capable of such violence and such tenderness. I leaned into the ghost of her touch, my eyes fluttering shut. I wanted her to bridge the gap. I wanted her to mark me with the clay one last time. The tension was a physical ache, a tight coil in my stomach pulling me toward her. It was intimate in a way that transcended skin. It was the intimacy of being fully, completely known. But she didn't touch me. She let her hand drop. The restraint was more powerful than any caress. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. "You have your story," she said softly. "I have more than that," I replied. The storm outside broke, the rain slowing to a gentle weeping against the glass. The studio fell into a strange, clean calm. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was empty, waiting to be filled. I looked at the bust, then at her, and realized the duel was over. I had lost. And in losing, I had finally found something worth keeping. Packing up felt less like leaving a workspace and more like dismantling a shrine. The silence in the studio had shifted again. It was no longer oppressive or challenging. It was protective. A heavy blanket I was now stripping away, layer by layer. I folded my wool coat, the fabric feeling stiff and alien against my skin, a costume from a play I no longer remembered how to perform. I picked up my notebook, the one I had barely opened, the one filled with blank pages instead of biting witticisms. It felt lighter now, or perhaps I was just stronger. I stopped to look at my hands as I fastened the buttons of my coat. They were different. The manicure was ruined, the polish chipped away to reveal the pale, vulnerable nail beneath. My cuticles were stained with gray dust that even the harsh scrubbing in the slop sink hadn't fully removed. They looked rough. They looked capable. They looked like they belonged to someone who touched the world instead of just pointing at it from a safe distance. Paisley watched me from the workbench. She wasn't working. She was leaning against the heavy oak table, arms crossed over her chest, the tension in her shoulders finally unspooling. She looked smaller, without the violence of the chisel in her hand, human-sized again, though the gravity around her remained dense enough to bend the light. She reached into the pocket of her work pants and pulled something out. It wasn't a grand gesture. She simply walked over, her boots silent on the concrete this time, and held out her hand. "Here," she said. Her voice was rough, stripped of the command she'd used for 10 days, leaving only the grit. I opened my palm. She dropped a small, jagged piece of white marble into it. It was a chip from the first block she'd attacked on day one, sharp-edged and cold. It felt heavy for its size, dense with the memory of the earth and the violence of her strike. "Keep it," she murmured, her eyes holding mine, dark and unreadable. "When you're back in your glass tower, when you're typing your perfect, sterile sentences, touch this. Remind yourself of the texture. Remind yourself that the world isn't smooth. It's sharp, and it cuts. I closed my fingers around the stone. The sharp edge dug into my palm, a pinch of pain that felt grounding. I won't forget. You might, she said, a shadow of her old arrogance flickering behind her eyes. Comfort is a powerful eraser. It smooths out the edges until you forget you ever bled. Don't let the comfort take you back. Not this time, I promised. And I meant it. The woman who had walked in here 10 days ago was gone, left in the dust on the floor, sculpted into the clay bust that would dry and crack and endure. We walked to the heavy iron door together. The distance between us was charged, electric, filled with 10 days of shared breath and sweat and silence. I waited for a hug, a handshake, some conventional seal of departure. But Paisley didn't operate on convention. She pulled the bolt back, clack, and the sound was final. She opened the door to the gray London afternoon. The noise of the city rushed in, sirens, traffic, the dull roar of millions of people living safely. And it felt violent. It felt foreign and shallow. Go, she said. We stood on the threshold. She didn't touch me. She just looked at me. A long, weighted look that traveled from my eyes to my mouth and back. It was a look that acknowledged everything we hadn't done, everything we had felt, and the permanent alteration of our trajectories. It was intimate precisely because it refused to be sentimental. Goodbye, Paisley, I whispered. She didn't answer. She just nodded once, sharp and precise, and closed the door. The lock slid home. I was alone on the pavement. The air smelled of diesel and rain, thin and chemical compared to the rich, ozone-heavy atmosphere of the foundry. I walked toward the main road, my legs feeling heavy, my senses overwhelmed by the chaos of the street. I hailed a black cab, the motion automatic, but my hand was clutching the piece of marble in my pocket so tight my knuckles turned white. I sat in the back of the cab, watching the city blur past, realizing I didn't recognize it. I didn't recognize my own reflection in the window. The critic was dead. The duel had destroyed her. And as the cab merged into traffic, I realized I was terrifyingly, wonderfully free. Back in my sterile, white-walled apartment, the silence felt empty, not pregnant like the studio. I sat at my glass desk, the screen glowing blank. I didn't write the review. I couldn't. Instead, I picked up a pen. I didn't write a critique. I started to sketch, a messy, imperfect line that shook with honest effort. I had lost the challenge, undeniably. But in the wreckage of my ego, I had finally found my voice. If you want to discover what happens when you stop judging and start feeling, subscribe for the next story, where everything unravels. Tell me in the comments, what passion are you too afraid to pursue?